Oh, what a glorious day this was supposed to be. Commander Vorthak of the mighty Keltharian Empire, standing tall at 8 feet and 3 inches, he watched the primitive human transport vessel lumber through the docking bay like a wounded space whale. The thing looked like it had been assembled by blind children using recycled garbage and pure optimism. But here we were, hosting these adorable little creatures in what the Galactic Council so generously called a cultural exchange program. Cultural exchange. Right, more like babysitting duty for the galaxy's newest members. The airlock hissed open with all the grace of a dying rodent, and out stepped the human delegation. 3 of them. Just 3. As if 3 humans could possibly represent anything worth learning from their entire species. Commander Vorthak adjusted his ceremonial armor and tried not to laugh. These humans barely reached his chest, covered in what they probably considered advanced combat gear that looked like it belonged in a museum exhibit titled Primitive Warfare in the embarrassing years. "Welcome to Training Facility Omega-7, Vorthak announced with practiced diplomatic courtesy, his voice echoing through the pristine metallic corridors. "I am Commander Vorthak, and I will be overseeing your educational experience during your stay with us." The lead human, a female with short dark hair and eyes that seemed far too calm for someone standing in the presence of superior alien technology, simply nodded. She didn't even crane her neck to gawk at the towering architecture or the floating energy displays that usually left visiting species speechless with wonder. How disappointingly underwhelming. "Thank you for having us, Commander," she replied in that flat, monotone way humans spoke. "We're looking forward to learning from your training methods." Learning. Ha! What could these soft, slow, technologically backward creatures possibly hope to learn from the Keltharian military? Their homeworld was barely past the stage of throwing rocks at each other, and here they were, pretending they belonged among the stars. The Galactic Council's inclusion policies had clearly gotten out of hand. But orders were orders, and Vorthak was nothing if not professional. He would show these humans around, let them observe some basic combat techniques, maybe even let them try a few simple exercises. It would be like watching toddlers play with toy weapons. Harmless, mildly entertaining, and ultimately forgettable. "Follow me," Vorthak said, turning toward the training chambers. "Try to keep up." The human delegation consisted of 3 specimens that could have been plucked from any backwater military academy. Captain Maya Torres, the apparent leader, stood barely 5 feet 6 inches tall and possessed the unsettling habit of maintaining perfect eye contact while saying absolutely nothing. Her silence wasn't the respectful quiet of someone overwhelmed by superior technology. No, this was something else entirely. Something that made Vorthak's secondary stomachs churn with inexplicable unease. Sergeant Jake Sullivan appeared to be their heavy weapons specialist, though his idea of heavy weaponry looked like something Keltharian children would use for target practice. The human carried himself with a casual swagger that suggested either supreme confidence or complete ignorance of his surroundings. Probably the latter. He kept chewing on some primitive plant matter and occasionally spitting into a small container. Disgusting. Corporal Lisa Park, the smallest of the 3, couldn't have weighed more than a Keltharian teenager. She wore thick optical enhancement devices on her face and carried what appeared to be a datapad that looked older than some civilizations. Yet she moved with the same unsettling calm as her companions, as if walking through the most advanced military facility in the galaxy was just another Tuesday. "Allow me to introduce my staff," Vorthak announced as they entered the main training hall. "Training Master Kellex oversees our combat instruction programs." Kellex stepped forward, his 8'4" frame draped in ceremonial training robes that shimmered with embedded technology. His forearms moved in a traditional greeting gesture that had taken him decades to master. The humans barely glanced at this display of cultural sophistication. "And this is Combat Specialist Zendara, our finest hand-to-hand combat instructor." Zendara was impressive even by Keltharian standards. 8 feet 6 inches of pure muscle and enhanced reflexes, with cybernetic implants that boosted her reaction time to near superhuman levels. Her training record was flawless, absolutely flawless. She had never lost a single combat exercise in her 15-year career. She looked down at the humans with what Vorthak recognized as professional curiosity. "Interesting," she said in her characteristic deep voice. "They're even smaller than the reports indicated." Jake Sullivan chose that moment to spit again, making a small ping sound as his projectile hit the container. "Why all got coffee around here?" he asked with the tone of someone requesting directions to the bathroom. Coffee. They were in the presence of the galaxy's most advanced military training facility, and this human wanted coffee. Captain Torres finally spoke. "We appreciate the introductions, Commander. When do we begin?" "Ah, eager to learn." Vorthak clapped his hands together with genuine amusement. "Very well. Kellex, please demonstrate our basic combat forms for our guests." The training hall transformed at Kellex's gesture, holographic opponents materializing in the center ring. What followed was a display of martial prowess that had impressed delegates from dozens of advanced civilizations. Kellex moved like liquid lightning, his forearms creating a blur of perfectly coordinated strikes. Each movement flowed into the next with mechanical precision, enhanced by cybernetic implants that calculated optimal angles and force distribution in real time. The holographic enemies didn't stand a chance. Kellex dismantled them with surgical efficiency, his enhanced reflexes allowing him to counter attacks before they were even fully formed. When the demonstration ended, the silence in the hall was typically reverential. Except the humans weren't silent with awe. They were silent while taking notes. Captain Torres scribbled something on an actual paper notepad. As if digital recording technology was beyond their primitive capabilities. Sergeant Sullivan had stopped chewing his disgusting plant matter and was studying Kellex with the intensity of someone trying to solve a particularly challenging puzzle. Corporal Park was sketching diagrams on her ancient datapad, occasionally adjusting those ridiculous optical enhancers. "Impressive technique," Torres said finally. "Very structured." Structured. What a charmingly inadequate word to describe 15 years of advanced military training. "Now," Vorthak continued, warming to his role as educator, "you'll notice that Keltharian combat methodology relies heavily on our natural advantages. Superior reach, enhanced strength, cybernetic reflexes, and of course our additional limbs." He gestured proudly at Kellex's forearms. "These biological and technological enhancements allow us to maintain tactical superiority in virtually any combat scenario." The humans nodded politely, as if he were explaining basic arithmetic to gifted children. "Your species, of course, lacks these advantages," Vorthak continued with diplomatic delicacy. "Limited to 2 arms, slower reflexes, reduced strength capacity, and—" He paused, searching for a kind way to phrase it, more fragile skeletal structure. "But I'm sure you've developed your own creative approaches to overcome these natural limitations." Sullivan finally spoke up. "Oh, we've got a few tricks." "Excellent." Vorthak beamed. "Perhaps you'd like to demonstrate some of your human techniques?" "Nothing too strenuous, of course. We wouldn't want anyone to get hurt." The 3 humans exchanged a look. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but something passed between them that made Vorthak's confidence waver slightly. It was the look of predators who had just been offered fresh prey. "Sure," Torres said, her voice maintaining that same flat, emotionless tone. "We'd be happy to try a few moves." Zendara stepped forward, her massive frame casting a shadow over the diminutive human captain. "I volunteer to assist with the demonstration," she announced. "Don't worry, Captain Torres. I'll be very gentle." Torres looked up at the 8'6" combat specialist and smiled for the first time since arriving. It wasn't a pleasant smile. What happened next would haunt Vorthak's dreams for cycles to come. Maya Torres stepped onto the training mat with the casual confidence of someone entering their own living room. She moved to the center, rolled her shoulders once, twice, and then simply stood there. Waiting? The contrast was almost comical. Zendara, towering above her like a monument to Keltharian genetic superiority, and Torres, looking like a child who had wandered into the wrong classroom. "We'll start with basic grappling techniques," Zendara announced, her voice carrying the patronizing tone of an adult explaining games to a toddler. "I'll demonstrate a simple hold, and you can try to do something, I suppose." The other humans had positioned themselves around the mat's perimeter, still taking those infernal notes. Sullivan had resumed chewing his plant matter, while Park adjusted her optical enhancers and continued sketching. They showed about as much concern for their captain's safety as spectators watching a cooking demonstration. Zendara moved first, her enhanced reflexes allowing her to close the distance in a blur of motion. Her massive hands reached for Torres' shoulders, intending to demonstrate a basic restraint hold. Standard procedure. Gentle, controlled, educational. Except Torres moved. Not quickly, mind you. Not with any of the cybernetic enhancement or technological assistance that Keltharian combat relied upon. She simply shifted. Her body flowed like liquid around Zendara's grasp, and suddenly the 8-foot combat specialist found herself holding empty air while Torres had somehow repositioned herself behind Zendara's left arm. "Interesting," Zendara muttered, her professional pride slightly stung. "Let me try that again." This time she didn't hold back quite as much. Enhanced strength engaged, Zendara grabbed Torres around the waist and lifted her clean off the ground. The little human weighed practically nothing, and Zendara held her there like a toy mid-drill, demonstrating her complete physical dominance. "You see," Vorthak called out to the other humans, "unable to resist the teaching moment, superior strength allows us to control the combat space entirely. Your captain is completely helpless in this position." Torres, dangling 3 feet off the ground in Zendara's grip, turned her head slightly and looked directly at Vorthak. She was still smiling. What happened next defied every law of physics that Vorthak thought he understood. Torres' body seemed to fold in on itself, her spine bending at angles that should have been anatomically impossible. Her legs, which had been kicking uselessly in the air, suddenly wrapped around Zendara's arm like a vice. But not just any vice. A vice that was tightening with the inexorable pressure of a collapsing star. Zendara's confident expression shifted to confusion, then to discomfort, then to something approaching alarm. "What are you? How are you?" The sound that followed was not loud. It was barely audible, really. A soft, wet crack that seemed to echo through the training hall with the finality of a judge's gavel. Zendara's collarbone snapped like a dry twig, the bone simply giving way under pressure that shouldn't have been possible from such a small creature. The 8-foot combat specialist, the finest hand-to-hand fighter in the Keltharian military, the warrior who had never lost a single training exercise in 15 years, dropped to her knees with a scream that would have shattered glass if the training hall hadn't been equipped with sound dampeners. Torres landed on her feet with the grace of a dancer, brushed an imaginary speck of dust from her uniform, and walked away from the mat. She didn't run. She didn't celebrate. She didn't even look back at the writhing form of Zendara, who was clutching her shattered collarbone and making sounds that Vorthak's translator couldn't properly interpret. She just walked away, maintaining that same unnerving silence she'd carried since arriving. Sullivan spit into his container again. "Nice form, Cap-N," he said casually. "Though you could have gone for the shoulder instead. Cleaner break." Park nodded approvingly without looking up from her sketches. The leverage angle was perfect. Textbook application of joint manipulation under gravitational disadvantage. Vorthak stood frozen, watching his finest combat instructor writhe on the floor while 3 humans discussed the incident like they were reviewing a minor training exercise. The universe had just stopped making sense. The training hall erupted into controlled chaos as Keltharian medical personnel rushed to Zendara's aid. Emergency scanners materialized from hidden compartments, hovering around the injured combat specialist like concerned metal birds. The readings they displayed made Vorthak's secondary heart skip beats. Complete fracture of the clavicle, severe muscle trauma, and what the scanners delicately termed catastrophic structural compromise. "How?" Killick stammered, his forearms gesticulating wildly as he tried to process what he'd just witnessed. How did a creature 1/3 her size generate that kind of leverage? The physics don't compute. Jake Sullivan wandered over to examine the medical readings with the casual interest of someone checking the weather. "Oh, that's just basic training stuff," he said, popping another piece of his plant matter into his mouth. "Maya's actually holding back quite a bit. You should see what she does when she's not being polite. Basic training stuff." The words hung in the air like a toxic gas. "Holding back?" Vorthak's voice cracked slightly. "That was restrained?" "Well, sure," Sullivan shrugged, spitting into his container with practiced aim. "I mean, she could have gone for the neck vertebrae, but that would have been rude. We're guests here." Lisa Park looked up from her sketching long enough to nod sagely. "The C7 vertebra would have been the optimal target for maximum incapacitation with minimal permanent damage," she added helpfully. Though the clavicle break was more educational. They were discussing the systematic dismantling of a trained Keltharian warrior like it was a classroom demonstration. "Perhaps," Vorthak said, his diplomatic training struggling to maintain composure, "you could explain your training methods?" "For cultural understanding?" Sullivan grinned, revealing teeth that looked disturbingly sharp for an herbivorous species. "Sure thing. Lisa, show him your collection." Park sighed and began rolling up her sleeves. What was revealed made every Keltharian in the room take an involuntary step backward. Her arms were a roadmap of healed injuries, long, pale lines where flesh had been split and mended, circular marks where joints had been dislocated and reset, and strange geometric patterns that could only have come from repeated impact trauma. "Training accidents," she explained matter-of-factly, pointing to a particularly impressive scar that ran from her elbow to her wrist. "Life work practice. Sullivan was showing me proper blade deflection, and I miscalculated the angle." "You cut yourself," Kellix whispered in horror. "Oh, not just once," Park laughed, a sound that made Vorthak's skin crawl. "It took about 30 attempts before I got the muscle memory right. Though to be fair, I only needed medical attention for 12 of them. 12. 12 times this tiny creature had allowed herself to be cut open in the name of training, and she spoke about it like discussing grocery shopping." Sullivan nodded approvingly. "Lisa's tough. You should see Jake Martinez from Delta Company. That guy broke his own ribs 14 times learning proper fall techniques. Never complained once." "Broke his own ribs?" Vorthak felt like he was trapped in some sort of fever dream. "Deliberately?" "Well, not deliberately." Torres spoke up from where she was calmly observing Zindara's medical treatment. "But when you're learning to absorb impact properly, you're going to break a few bones. It's just part of the process." Part of the process. These creatures routinely inflicted injuries on themselves that would hospitalize a Keltharian for weeks, and they considered it normal educational procedure. "How do you survive such brutal training methods?" Kellix asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Torres turned to look at him with those unnervingly calm eyes. "We heal," she said simply, "and we learn, and we get stronger." The medical scanners were finally stabilizing Zindara's condition, but she remained unconscious. Professional combat specialists didn't faint from pain. They were trained to maintain consciousness under the most extreme circumstances. But then again, they'd never encountered anything quite like humans before. The revelation hit Vorthak like a collapsing star. These weren't fragile creatures requiring protection and gentle handling. These were something else entirely. Something that had crawled out of whatever nightmare realm had spawned them and somehow convinced the Galactic Council they were civilized. "Your homeworld," he said slowly, pieces of a terrifying puzzle clicking into place. "Tell me about your homeworld." Sullivan laughed, a sound that held no warmth whatsoever. "Earth? Oh, Earth's a real paradise. Gravity's about twice what most species consider comfortable. Weather systems that can level cities in minutes. Tectonic plates that shift around just for fun. And that's before you get to the wildlife." "Wildlife?" Kellix squeaked. "Well, there's the land predators," Park began, counting on her scarred fingers. "Bears, tigers, wolves, crocodiles. Then you've got your ocean predators, sharks, jellyfish, octopi. Flying predators, eagles, hawks, vultures. And the microscopic ones are probably the worst. Bacteria, viruses, parasites that'll eat you from the inside out. Torres nodded thoughtfully. Don't forget the plants. Some of them are carnivorous. Others are just poisonous enough to kill you if you touch them wrong. Vorthak felt his third stomach trying to relocate itself. And you live there? Voluntarily? Born and raised, Sullivan confirmed cheerfully. Of course, most of us don't make it to adulthood. Natural selection's a real pain that way. But the ones who do survive, he gestured vaguely at Torres, who was still studying Zendara's unconscious form with clinical interest. What do you do for recreation? Vorthak asked, though part of him already dreaded the answer. Oh, the usual stuff, Park said. Rock climbing, deep-sea diving, volcano surfing, extreme skiing, base jumping, cave exploring, storm chasing. Storm chasing? Kellix interrupted. You pursue dangerous weather patterns for entertainment? Just the really big ones, Sullivan explained. Tornadoes, hurricanes, lightning storms. Though personally I prefer ice climbing. Nothing like hanging off a frozen waterfall by your fingertips to really get the blood pumping. Torres smiled that unsettling smile again. Jake does mixed martial arts in his spare time. Full contact, no protective gear. Last month he fought in a tournament where they encouraged broken bones. Encouraged? Vorthak's voice had risen to a pitch that would have embarrassed him under normal circumstances. Sure, Sullivan shrugged. Judges gave extra points for fighting through major injuries. I took second place even after my opponent shattered my kneecap in round 2. The medical scanners attending to Zendara began emitting warning chimes. Her vital signs were spiking as consciousness returned, and with it, the full awareness of her injury. The combat specialist, who had never lost a training exercise, was whimpering like a frightened child. Is she going to be all right? Torres asked with what might have been genuine concern. Eventually, the medical technician replied, though she'll require extensive reconstruction surgery and months of rehabilitation. This type of injury typically requires a full cycle to heal properly. A full cycle? Park looked genuinely surprised. That's like a year, right? For a broken collarbone? The medical technician nodded solemnly. Sullivan whistled low. Tough break. I snapped mine twice last year during training exercises. Was back on duty in 6 weeks both times. 6 weeks. Vorthak stared at these 3 impossibly resilient creatures and finally understood the truth that would change everything. Humans weren't the galaxy's newest primitive species stumbling toward civilization. They were apex predators wearing the mask of civilization, and they had just walked into his facility. The silence that followed was broken only by Zendara's labored breathing and the soft hum of medical equipment. Vorthak found himself staring at Captain Maya Torres, who had remained remarkably quiet throughout the entire exchange. She stood with her hands clasped behind her back, watching the medical team work with the detached interest of a scientist observing an experiment. Captain Torres, Vorthak said finally, his voice carefully controlled. You've been unusually quiet during this cultural exchange. Torres turned those unsettling calm eyes toward him, and for the first time since arriving, she truly spoke. We were told this was a training exercise, she said, her words measured and precise. We were instructed to observe, learn, and demonstrate basic human combat techniques. We were specifically ordered not to cause any permanent injuries or create diplomatic incidents. The implications of her statement hit the room like a physical blow. You mean Kellix started, then stopped, unable to finish the thought. What you witnessed today was the absolute minimum force necessary to complete the exercise, Torres continued matter-of-factly. Zendara will make a full recovery. In human terms, this qualifies as exceptionally gentle treatment. Sullivan nodded agreement. Cap N's right. We've been real careful not to hurt anybody. Diplomatic protocols and all that. Hurt anybody? Vorthak's voice cracked completely. You shattered her collarbone. Surface injury, Park commented, not looking up from her notes. Could have gone for the spine, but that seemed excessive for a friendly demonstration. Torres stepped closer to Vorthak, and despite the significant height difference, The commander found himself taking an involuntary step backward. "Commander," she said quietly, "we appreciate the cultural exchange. But I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about what humans are capable of. We're not the primitive species you think we are. We're survivors from a world that spent millions of years trying to kill us. We got very good at not dying." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. 3 hours later, Vorthak sat alone in his office, staring at a classified report that would change humanity's status throughout the galaxy. His hands shook slightly as he typed the final recommendation: immediate reclassification of human species from developing civilization to extreme caution required. Suggest all future interactions be conducted through remote communication only. He paused, then added one final note: under no circumstances should humans be considered harmless. The report was filed, encrypted, and transmitted to Galactic Command within minutes. Vorthak never slept well again,